It was the destination for the first Underground Railroad, a sanctuary for families fleeing slavery, and the first free Black community in what is now the United States. But this enormous piece of American history was nearly lost to time and development. I'm joined now by Dr. Kathleen Deagan, the archaeologist who literally excavated Fort Mose and in so doing saved it. She is also the author of a newly reissued history of the place, Fort Mose, Colonial America's Black Fortress of Freedom, which she co-authored with Darcie MacMahon and Jane Landers. Dr. Deagan, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having us.
So, first of all, congratulations on the book. It is a beautiful piece of artwork. It is a beautiful piece of writing. What prompted your decision to update and reissue the book?
Well, the book was first published 30 years ago, and since that time, so much more has been learned about Fort Mose. Dr. Jane Landers, who was actually a graduate student on the original project, has continued to do research, and the Fort Mose Historical Society has been formed and has done tremendous things, and the Florida Park Service has built a museum, and so the work has gone on, and we wanted to update the book to reflect all of these new information.
I want to talk more about the work that Jane has done because it has really expanded the story. But for people who aren't familiar with just your trajectory here, you actually started working on the site back in 1971.
That's right.
That's extraordinary. And so, that original research at that time, remind us of what the kind of what the mood was, what the knowledge was generally about Fort Mose, what the reception was, and kind of what you were trying to show when you first went out there.
Well, I was actually a student myself with my professor, Charles Fairbanks, who was eager to locate Fort Mose. It really wasn't known at all outside of academia, and there were a few historians who had written about Fort Mose, but uh, we wanted to locate it and see if we could learn more about daily life of the people, just learn more. And we thought at that time that we had found a site thanks to Mr. Jack Williams of St. Augustine, who owned the property. But many years went by before funding could be found to actually study it.
Yeah, and so there was some, I guess, resistance to the idea of Fort Mose, and it may be hard for people to put themselves back in that time, in that place. But remind us what St. Augustine was like back then and why there was some resistance.
This was only 5 years, 6 years after the problems with the Civil War, Martin Luther King coming to St. Augustine, and the marches and violence. And so it was still a little raw, I think. And a lot of people just didn't believe in Fort Mose. They just didn't think that was a thing. And some of us were sort of accused of making this up to get state funding because ultimately we got funds from the Florida legislature, thanks to Representative Bill Clark and the Black Legislative Caucus, who believed in it and helped us demonstrate that this was Fort Mose. But there was some discontent and that this was just something we were making up.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe hard for people to believe because there's a lot of emphasis now in St. Augustine on Black history and, this Black Heritage Trail and all of the sites that were important in the civil rights movement. But the idea that people didn't actually believe in Fort Mose does seem hard to imagine.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
To me, certainly. Well, it's a very different story of Black history. It's not about slavery or plantations.
Yeah.
It's really about uh, the fight for freedom, the resistance, and the determination to be free. And I think that's not a story you hear a lot in American history in textbooks. So it was perhaps a little bit difficult at first.
I want to read a little bit from the beginning of the book because I think this really encapsulates what you're saying there. You wrote, most Americans think that African American history began in 1619 with plantation slavery in English colonies, and that this determined the fate of Africans brought unwillingly to America. Fort Mose's history challenges that narrative. It is instead a story of the relentless pursuit of freedom by politically astute people of African descent who made effective choices to realize their vision of self-determination. And it continues, the African experience in colonial history was much more than slavery and oppression. So the story of Fort Mose really is a story of a free Black community. Remind us about how it was sort of the original southern terminus of the Underground Railroad.
Yes, the original people who came to St. Augustine to establish Fort Mose had been enslaved in South Carolina plantations, and through word of either Native American networks or African networks, they learned that if they made it to St. Augustine, they would be given sanctuary
And that was because it was under Spanish control.
under Spanish control. In fact, in 1693, the King of Spain issued a proclamation saying that if anyone came to Florida or made it to Florida and became Catholic, they would gain their freedom. Um, both the men and the women, he specified. And so by 1720s, there were about 150 people who had made that trek, and they often came with Native American guides. They were brought here going south instead of north with Native American allies and guides.
And you say that this was Florida's brief experiment in progressive society. This was the first free Black community in the United States, but it wasn't the only one under Spanish control in the world. There were other similar Spanish colonies like this in Panama and Venezuela, in Hispaniola, places where people of different races and ethnicities live together as Catholics, but with relative equality.
That's absolutely right. And Fort Mose is exciting to us because it's in our state and it's a unique story in American history, but it's connected to a much wider world of people and policies. And mostly this happened in the Spanish colonies of the Americas. And I think largely due to the influence of Catholicism.
Yeah. So back to the beginnings of your excavation. You started there in the early 70s. It wasn't a consistent timeline of working out there.
No, we actually didn't begin major excavations until 1984 when we were able to get funds to continue the work and worked there through the end of 1985. But we had to abandon the project in a sense because of the conflict between the landowner and the state of Florida. Um, Florida, the state wanted to acquire that as part of the public domain. And as you can imagine, when one person gets an appraisal for land value and another gets an appraisal, there's always a little difference. And so there was a quite a big difference in that case, and we were asked to leave the site because of that. Um, so that was a problem, but we still had a lot of funding. And what we did, and this is where Darcie MacMahon came into the project, we, at the Florida Museum of Natural History, developed a large traveling exhibit on Fort Mose that traveled the country for 11 years and had to come back and be refurbished. And meanwhile, the state was able to acquire the property, unfortunately, through eminent domain, um, which was not ideal.
Yeah, I mean the dynamic with the property owner at the time, I would say, was a very dynamic dynamic. I
Yes,
mean,
yes.
Jack Williams was, a little bit of a contrarian. He definitely was a character. He had been digging on that property himself relentlessly because he was interested in sort of a later occupation of the fort.
The site of Fort Mose, or the ruins of Fort Mose, had been used by the so-called American Patriots, a group of kind of renegades who wanted, or they weren't all renegades, but a loose group of soldiers and mercenaries who wanted to acquire Spain for the new United
Or acquire
States.
Florida.
Florida, excuse
Yeah,
me,
yeah.
Florida. And so there was kind of the part of the War of 1812 in Florida, the Patriots' War, they called it. And Fort Mose was a base camp for that. And that was really Jack's principal interest,
Yeah, so he was interested in relics from that era.
that era.
He was less interested in the Fort Mose story.
Considerably less interested.
Yeah, and what do you
But he
attribute that
was,
to?
I don't think probably he or many people at that time related to that as really part of our history.
Mhm.
There was, I mean, in North America, I've always been just bemused by why more people still don't know and understand what Fort Mose was about, even after the traveling exhibit. And we've done dozens of teacher workshops over the years, and it hasn't seemed to resonate or really grip the public imagination in the way we always thought it would. But that may change, I think, now that the Park Service and the Fort Mose Historical Society have created this representation, life size, of the fort at the site. And I think that's maybe bringing a lot more attention to it.
I know that there's the archaeological elements of this dig and finding what you found out there, all of the, pottery and the flint stocks and anything that has been discovered out there has been recovered through really arduous labor. Can you explain the work, how it's had to progress, sort of the delicacy that it requires to find things specific to the Fort Mose period?
I'm glad you asked that because it really was a, a delicate situation because the site had been occupied before Fort Mose by Native people and afterwards by Norcan farmers. And so the Fort Mose lair of the place where their uh, refuse was laid down, where they dug holes and put posts, was about maybe a 6-inch thick layer in about 2 meters. So it did require hand digging with brushes and shovels and just water. We water screened put everything through water so that we could really see right at the point what was coming up. But that's, I think, a general process in archaeology. You dig about 2 inches at a time and stop and look at everything.
Yeah.
But it takes a long time to do that.
And so it's labor intensive, but even getting to this site back when you began working on it was difficult. It wasn't like you could just, I mean, it's surrounded by water. You would have to kind of wade through the marsh and the muck with your students or, on your own.
That was the case, and it was everyone just got high boots, and we marched. Sometimes it was knee deep, sometimes it was just mud because it was a tidal area. Interestingly, the whole area around that fort, which was somehow preserved, was dredged out by Henry Flagler to provide the fill underneath what's today Flagler College and Cordova Street in St. Augustine. And it wasn't always that wet, but it is now. And getting to the site was uh, arduous. And I remember carrying our wheelbarrows full of things in and out when the water was too high. And actually, Flagler College has picked up the mantle on working at Fort Mose. Dr. Lori Lee had several field schools there, and they had to go all the way to Volano Beach and over by boat every day to get to Fort Mose, which was very time consuming.
I want to return to Jane Landers because she did some research, I think, in Spain. And in terms of like, was Fort Mose real or not? For a long time, people didn't think that there was a record of it, any written record of it, or not much of one. And she was able to find a lot more. Can you talk about the work that she did?
Well, that's exactly right. I think so many people thought, well, it's a community of formerly enslaved Black people. They couldn't read or write. There's no record. We don't know anything. And Jane, even as a graduate student, as part of our first project, went to Spain to see what could be found. And she found a tremendous amount of information. And it kind of goes to show that if you're not looking for something in some of these archives, you probably won't find it. But she found the names and birth dates and places of origin of all the people who lived there. She was able to locate letters written by the leader of the Fort Mose militia group, Francisco Melendez, who was really a larger than life character. He was literate and just descriptions of the buildings. So we actually had a much more detailed in, picture of Fort Mose because of that work.
And I mean, Francisco Menendez, who's not related to Pedro Menendez, but was a free Black who came from Africa and really was sort of a swashbuckling figure.
Very much so. He was a Mandinga, and came to Carolinas and escaped. Actually, he escaped early and fought against the English with the Yamasee natives in the Yamasee War, 1715, and came with them to St. Augustine and went through a whole series of things. But he was appointed as the captain of the militia at Fort Mose. There was a free black militia in
Spoke 4 languages.
at least 4 languages,
Yeah.
and went off to become a privateer, uh, attacking British boats.
And led the Battle of Bloody Mose, is that right?
That's right.
And so that was a seminal moment in the history of that fort where basically the occupants were chased out by General Oglethorpe and the English and then retook it in a really kind of brutal campaign, but got rid of everybody and sort of reclaimed it.
Right. The people of Mosé were evacuated when the Spanish realized that the English were coming. Oglethorpe was coming, but the English took the abandoned fort as a headquarters, and the Spanish and African troops kind of crept up overland and retook it. And it was, by all accounts, uh, a very bloody battle.
Yeah, and that's something that is reenacted now on that site
Yes.
pretty much every year. I wonder if you could just talk about how this has changed conversations in the community overall when it comes to race. It's always been a difficult topic for St. Augustine.
It has, but I think to me, the Fort Mose Historical Society, which really was founded based on the uh, verification of the fort and the archaeology that was done, has changed the dialogue tremendously. And it was the first organization I belonged to in St. Augustine that had black and white community members all working for the same thing. And it was remarkable. And I think it has led to a lot now. Black history in St. Augustine is uh, done in many different ways. We have the Excelsior Museum, the Accord, there's the Black Heritage Trail. And I think that a lot of that has been the impetus of that particular group. So I give them a lot of credit.
And that's a group that you were formative in founding, just in the same way you were formative in discovering this fort. I mean, I imagine you must be very proud considering not just the discovery, what it's meant, but kind of how it's broadened the conversation around race in St. Augustine.
Well, thank you for saying that, but it's true. I think of all I've been around a long time doing archaeology and have done a lot of work over the years, but I really feel that Fort Mose, in a way, is the most important thing that my colleagues and I have ever done because it actually made a real difference in what we understand and how we interact with each other. And I can't think of any other project here or in the Caribbean that has done the same.
Well, Dr. Kathleen Deagan, she's author of Fort Mose, Colonial America's Black Fortress of Freedom, and the archaeologist who discovered Fort Mose, helped us all know that history. Dr. Deagan, thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.